Okay, we're going to talk about the dielectric inertial plane. It's always fun being able to see in absolute darkness. Anyway, here we have our 1-inch neodymium iron boron. Looking at the field. Now, you need to understand the way this ferrocell works. It's patented by Tim Vanderelli several years ago. Most people don't know about it, but you have a string of LEDs around a pair of lenses, in between which is sandwiched some micron thin ferrofluid solution. And let's take a look at our dielectric inertial plane, what you would call the edge. Incorrectly called the block wall. Now if you look up a block wall, BLOCH wall, or domain wall, or magnetic domain wall, which we're looking at right now. Here we have, let me get my little pointer. Here we have one pole, and here we have our other pole, and right here along the middle is the dielectric inertial plane. One of the great mental confusions people have, as I slowly turn this, you can see the magnetism interacting with the dielectricity, is that, well, why is there a dielectric inertial plane in the middle of a magnet? Why is it self-seeking, self-centering? Well, that has to do with the fact that magnetism and dielectricity are repulsive at 180 degrees from each other, not at 90 degrees, but if you were to look at a magnet diagram in my book, you would see that, well, it looks like magnetism is occurring at 90 degrees to the dielectric inertial plane, which makes no sense. But in a binding system of a permanent magnet or otherwise, even in AC transmission lines, you will understand that within that binding system, the furthest max throw that magnetism can go, which is, as Faraday and Maxwell called it, the quote-unquote dielectric field, the max throw of 180 degree repulsion of two fields is a double hyperbola. Now, on either pole of any magnet, whether it's neodymium iron boron or regular magnet, what you have here is you have one hyperbola and you have another hyperbola. And you have an accretion disk or dielectric inertial plane right here. Well, why does it occur at the center? It's the same thing as in fluid mechanics. If you jump in a bathtub full of water, you displace the water. The water seeks its own pressure gradients. Mother Nature does not do math. It is complex to some minds, but it is actually divinely simple. The reason that dielectricity goes towards the center, for lack of a better analogy, is because of the incommensurate nature of magnetodielectric conjugation within a binding system. So, how do you have two opposite fields conjugate each other at max throw, since they want to move 180 degrees from each other, within a binding system? Well, the way it works is a double hyperbola and an inertial plane. Now, if you bring two magnets together, if you have magnetic viewing film, which actually technically is not viewing film, but velocity viewing film, what you'll actually notice, we actually cannot see it on that, but you can see it on this and other demonstration models, is that an accretion disk of dielectricity will form between the two poles as they come together. There will be a shrinking sphere along which the equator will be the dielectric forming inertial plane. There'll be two shrinking spheres and quote-unquote what you call attraction, which is actually dielectric voidance. See, there's actually no such thing as magnetic attraction. And now you're thinking to yourself, oh my god, what is this nonsense? What do you mean? It's magnets coming together. There's some magnetic attraction, magnetic repulsion. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Magnetism is the radiation of dielectricity. It is the spatial component that makes up the entire inner atomic of every atom on Earth and what gives mass to matter. Dielectricity is counterspatial. It is inertial. It is centripetal. Okay? Magnetism is spatial. Centrifugal and centripetal in reciprocation, but centrifugal. It is radiation by definition. All charge necessitates discharge. Magnetism is literally the radiative discharge of dielectricity. And within the conjugate binding system of the field incommensurability of a magnet, the maximum throw, now this is mathematically proven by supercomputer models, of if you take a perfect sphere, which everybody understands, and you were to invert it, the maximum throw of an inverse sphere, now this is magnified from the inner atomic all the way to the macro. because that's all a magnet is. Let me apologize for using a crude analogy, but what a magnet is, or what you think you understand a magnet is nothing more than a magnetodielectric laser. Well, what does that mean? It means it is self-similar and coherent. It is point in specific, technically point non-specific self-similarity. As everybody knows, well actually very few people know, that if you were actually to take this magnet and if you're actually able to cut it 1,000 times, or 100,000 or 1,000,000 times, not that you could ever cut it that thin since it's ceramic material, but every little slice will have a quote-unquote north pole and a quote-unquote south pole and an inertial plane. And while you're saying, well, you know, why can't I just cut the magnet in the middle? You keep saying that the dielectric inertial plane is right in the center of the magnet, so, you know, if you cut it in half, you're gonna, you know, where is it? You know, your diagrams are wrong. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, you deal with some of these mental midgets that have 2D minds, cannot think in terms of incommensurability, and of course, we're not taught that sort of stuff in school. They don't understand that just like fluid dynamic models, field conjugation of repulsion in a binding system, which is what a magnet is. A magnet is nothing other than a ceramic. This one is neodymium iron boron, but it doesn't matter if it's a ferrite. But within the perfect conjugate system of the magnet, the interatomic magnetodielectricity has been brought into disequilibrium. This can occur from magnetic induction, where you take a really strong magnet like this and rub it on an iron bar, in which you induce a weak magnetization of an iron bar, or like these are created from charged cap banks, capacitor banks, which are discharged into magnetizing coils. But what that actually does, they call them magnetizing coils only because they create magnets. But what they actually do is they increase the dielectric capacitance inside the pre-magnet, quote unquote. Everything that you think is a magnet is actually a dielectric object with a ratio of 3.23606, etc., to 1 part magnetism. What happens is exactly like a gyroscope to a certain degree. It spins up the dielectric inertial flywheel, and just like fluid mechanics, the point of pressure equalization in opposite moving fields, remember, this is magnetism here, you have one pole and we have our other pole, these form a hyperbola. The inverse max throw of a sphere in 180-degree repulsion in a binding system, like a dog on a leash on a chain tied to a pole, the max throw is a double hyperbola. Just imagine a dog on a leash that's on a chain that's tied to a pole, is trying to get away from that pole for whatever reason. Keeps running around and around. It will make a centrifugal and centripetal pattern. Eventually it'll run out of chain, keeps working its way back and forth, reciprocating. Magnetism, magnetodielectricity within the perfect magnet works exactly the same as fluid mechanics. It's all mediated by lowest pressure gradient seeking. Mother Nature does not work low pressures against high pressures. It's irrelevant of whether it's a mass gravity. Now, every point you see here where these are actually coming together is a point of Q, electrification. You see the magnetic up here at the pole. When we're turning it spatially, what we're causing is electrification. Well, you're asking, well, why can't you get electricity to have a magnet? Well, it's the same thing as squeezing a balloon. You might have more pressure on one end, but less on the other end. Magnets self-equalize. That's the Mother Nature works. Obviously, you have to have a primary. You have to have a primary driver to drive a magnet, which is the same thing as a 3-element Yagi antenna, where you have your magnet being spun would be the driver element, and the copper conductive wires would be the reflector element, which is what copper or silver or gold is a dielectric reflector. And what is the director? The director is the right-hand rule of electrification. So electrification is exactly the same in an analogy as a Yagi antenna. You have your spinning magnet against copper conductor. So your magnet being spun by a primary source is your driver element. Your reflector are your copper windings, and your director is the right-hand rule. So what I'm trying to get to you, this is one of the fundamental principles of magnetism, is, well, how does a magnet work? You know, if you can cut it 1,000,000 times top to bottom against either pole, then how ultimately do you end up with a dielectric inertial plane right at the center? See, one thing physics has never explained, and it never has, and it never will, it may in the future, is it can never explain the word field. And the quote-unquote block wall, if you actually do a search, a Google search on block wall, you'll say, well, a block wall is a field domain which separates the boundary between the North Pole and the South Pole. If you break the magnet in half, you'll have two more magnets and a new block wall. Well, that's a description. That isn't an explanation, okay? Descriptions are not explanations. A child can describe something to you, but that doesn't mean he can explain it to you. The point that divides out ignorant fools and wisdom is the difference between describing something that you see and explaining something you see. If you actually look up domain wall or block wall, you'll see nothing but descriptions. The reason why any magnet, the block wall, you can see it best on magnetic viewing film, but you can see it right here. These parallel lines that move. Of course, they twist and torque because I'm turning the magnet. Remember, space does not exist. Space, no one on Earth ever has or ever will, or on any planet, see space do anything. Space does nothing. Space is nothing. Space acts on nothing. Space is a posterior attribute of a field. Principle of attribute reification that general relativity and quantum mechanics done is reified the attribute as the principle. This is a fallacy of attribute reification. It's like blaming horse shit for the appearance of flies. Well, no, I mean, that's the attribute. First comes the horse, then comes the horse shit. Pardon that crude analogy. But what you see here, the dielectric inertial plane. Now let me get another magnet so you can see it better. It's a little powerful. 1-inch cube. Let me see which I have here first. Oh, here we go. We got our inertial plane. You can see it a lot better here. We have our poles here. Now the reason light also bends in here, the most important point of my book, and it's been proven in Dr. Olev Defimchenko's works on gravitation, causality, and electromagnetism and other works, and also by Tim Vanderelli. I better not talk about that, but the last part of my book is that the missing secret of light, and explains the photoelectric effect and dismisses the wave-particle duality nonsense, is that the missing secret of light is that it has a z-axis radial dielectric component. We all know about the electromagnetism making up part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but what is not known and what explains the photoelectric effect, what explains this, because these are just LEDs around this double lens with nanoparticle ferrofluid, and what is bending the light is the magnetism, or this would be the magnetism here, and of course we have our dielectric centripetal point here. But what is bending the light is the dielectricity or the magnetism, depending on how I'm holding it here. I've proven that now with a laser and magnets, and another person has with a patent. I won't get into that. But one thing science is pathetically always guilty of is testing and getting results and reproducing results, but drawing the wrong conclusions. Now, the photoelectric effect has nothing to do with electromagnetism. What it has to do is with the radial dielectric. The shorter the wavelength, the greater the dielectric pulse. The nature of dielectricity is that the smaller the space, the greater the dielectric capacitance is. Now, this isn't my premise, my thought, or my idea. The missing secret of the geometry of light is, but Oliver Heaviside created the coaxial cable. Now, he never mentioned the missing secret of the geometry of light, and that its missing third component is a z-axis radial dielectric, which explains the photoelectric effect, dismisses Einstein's conclusions about his correct observations, but it also explains everything about magnetism. So dielectricity was the great irony is that Nikola Tesla gave us the AC generator, but Nikola Tesla's main interest, after Westinghouse and everybody started perfecting, and Steinmetz started perfecting the AC generators and motors, was dielectricity. This is nature's electricity. Now that's magnetism. Of course, our centripetal point right here is returning. That's our conjugate reintegration of the dielectric field. See, people think of, well, dielectricity, we think of electrostatics, and we think of magnetism as something else, and we think of electricity as something else. See, each one of these crossing points here, that is electrification. Why aren't you electrified by a magnet? Because the magnet is in perfect magnetodielectric homeostasis. It is in perfect field pressure equalization, unless I move it, disturb it, break it, heat it, etc. This is the magnetism interfering with the dielectricity. Every one of these crossing points, you can actually see it here. You see these twisting lines right here? That is electrification. If I were to spin it at high speeds, obviously against a copper coil, what you see right here, that is electrification. People think of electrification as occurring necessarily in the dielectric component, like the copper windings, but it is already occurring in space. I can show that to you in counter avoidance with two magnets. The point is that the dielectric inertial plane right here along the magnet is the interatomic magnetodielectricity, the incommensurability at which it is pushed towards the center. Now, something existing at the center, like a cream in an Oreo cookie, which you can actually identify and cut out, is not the same as something being pressed towards the center. Understanding this is important. If you don't understand this, you're never going to understand some of the field fundamentals and what makes a magnet, how a magnet works. You have to understand what is the maximum throw of two fields in a system where there is disequilibrium. That's how these magnets are created. Now, the hexagonal nature of the neodymium iron boron is especially good for holding a very powerful disequilibrium between magnetism and dielectricity. What you'll read is that an atom is 99.999%, etc., empty space. Well, this is complete nonsense and BS. There is no such thing as empty space. Space is a posterior attribute of a field. Now we have the nucleus of our atom, which is not under contention. What surrounds, what is within inside the inner atomic of any atom is an enormous amount of magnetism and dielectricity working out their own field conjugation. You can actually see this in atomic orbitals. You will see this double hyperbola. It will look like two figure eights, which is the magnetism. If you can actually see those balloons in atomic orbitals, you know where the dielectricity is. If you know where the dielectricity is, you know where the magnetism, vice versa. This is the hyperbola of one pole of radiation of the dielectricity. Dielectricity is charging. Magnetism is the discharge. Faraday and Maxwell called this the dielectric field. Do you think I'm actually telling you something that I invented? Now, uncovering the missing secrets of magnetism, how magnetism actually works, what a magnet really is, and uncovering the secrets of magnetism, that I figured out. But the fact that magnetism is the radiation of dielectricity is nothing new. I mean, this is the premise of Tesla, Faraday, Maxwell, J.J. Thomson, Oliver Heaviside. We see two things as totally different attributes, but what they are different modalities. I've shown you in the first fundamentals of magnetism, but what is occurring here is the discharge. All space is discharge. It is the attribute of radiation. Everything that makes mass massive has to do with magnetism. Gravity is centripetal. Now, dielectricity terminates into the creation of mass, but what makes up the nucleus are, of course, dielectric conglomerations as formed in galactic and stellar jets under enormous power. But what makes up the volume of any atom is magnetism. Magnetism is radiation. It is spatial. Polarization equals space equals radiation. The three are consummately inseparable. They are synonymous with each other. Here we see the other pole of the magnet. Let's move around towards the dielectric, and then towards the other pole. Remember, polarity is ridiculous. You can spin your wife, your cat, your dog, your parrot, your sandwich. You can spin anything you want. There's no such thing as clockwise and counterclockwise. When I'm moving this object, I'm moving it in one direction. The same thing is happening with the magnetism. Space and clockwise and counterclockwise are two perceptual mind screws of human perceptual understanding. The magnetism is moving in the same direction. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. You said that it's moving clockwise on one side and counterclockwise on the other, and you've got reciprocal centripetal reaction occurring opposite to any pole. Well, that's true, but the point is that you can take any object and spin it. It is moving in the same direction, not only physically, but electromagnetically. The only reason, take a rope, take anything. One end you're spinning, it looks like it's going clockwise. The other end, spinning it in the same direction, looks like it's going counterclockwise. Inverse spin is only a spatial perceptual error. Magnetism reciprocates itself along lowest pressure gradients. The dielectric inertial plane, like I said, if you do not understand this centripetal, counterspatial, charging, this is the principle behind all fields. Magnetism is the radiation, the discharge. This is where space is. Not that magnetism is space. Space is a posterior attribute of magnetism. There's no such thing as a field in space. Okay? That's a really important principle, and it's a huge claim, but it's true. You can see it and prove it with Dr. Oleg Defimchenko's work. I will show it to you in the 3rd or 4th edition of Uncovering the Missing Secrets of Magnetism. There is no such thing as a field in space. There is only space as an attribute posterior to a radiative field. This dielectric inertial plane, just like a gyroscopic flywheel, powers the entire system. This is point-in-specific self-similarity. Well, what does that mean? I don't know if you know much about holography, not that I'm trying to compare a magnet to a hologram, but not a holographic negative, which you hang on your wall, but a holographic positive. If you have a large holographic positive and you cut out a little tiny portion of it, you can reproject the laser through that and see the entire image again. You can take just a little tiny postage stamp out of a huge holographic positive, not a negative, and reproject the entire image from that. That is point-in-specific self-similarity. That's why you can take any magnet and cut it 1,000,000 times if you could, and each little slice will have a north pole and a south pole and a dielectric inertial plane. So some of these mental midgets, these morons of academia that spit out well-educated fools, do not understand that this midpoint here is only a midpoint because it is mediating two oppositely moving pressures of this double hyperbola of magnetism and the dielectric inertial plane of dielectricity. Now this is an inverse sphere. All space is a radiation definitionally. We talk about magnetic polarization. Well, what does polarization mean? Polarization means it is moving into space. It means it is radiation by definition of something else by something else. Nature only works in really simple terms. Charge, discharge, centripetal, centrifugal, convergent, divergent. Divergence is radiation. Divergence is space. Divergence is polarization. Space is nothing other than a posterior attribute of a field. So the great thing that quantum relativity and general mechanics has done is reified the attribute as the principle. Space does nothing. Space is nothing. Space acts on nothing. Everything is fields compiled upon fields, compiled upon fields, compiled on fields. Now, what is this term incommensurability? Well, it's easy to explain, but it's difficult for some people to understand. It goes all the way back to Pythagoras and the golden ratio and the golden section and what is incommensurable. It means self-similarity from the macro to the micro. Every little atom inside this magnet, when it is electrified, this magnet is of course created by electrification rather than induction, as you would take this magnet, rub it against a steel bar. But the incommensurability that makes up this magnet means every single little point along here, there is a disequilibrium between the magnetism that is spun up, for lack of a better analogy, and the resultant magnetism that moves away from it at maximum throw, which is a double hyperbola or an inverse sphere, which is mathematically proven by computer. That is the max inverse throw between two oppositely moving systems inside a binding system like this magnet. Now you see the magnetism here and you see the dielectricity here. You say, well, that's 90 degrees. That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's max throw in a binding system. Like a dog on a chain tied to a pole, it can only go so far. It's still bound within the binding system of this physical magnet. That's also why the max velocity of centrifugal magnetism is along the physical edge of a magnet. That's why you'll also get inverse field reciprocation in a ring magnet. Everything, just like fluid dynamics, works along lowest pressure gradients. Nature doesn't do math. She is very simplex. She's not necessarily simple, but this is incommensurability. If you do not understand this dielectric inertial plane and why it is forced to the middle here, you'll never understand anything. Like jumping in a bathtub, displacing the water, everything finds its equal balance by pressure gradient mediation. And since magnetism, the radiative discharge, the byproduct of the charging dielectric inertial plane, dielectricity and magnetism is the volume, or the quote-unquote air, in the balloon of every atom. That you have been taught that an atom is 99.99% empty space. There's just a nucleus and you have a charging, shell. That's nonsense. It's BS. An atom is completely full. Every single one, from hydrogen to plutonium and beyond, that's quote-unquote empty space between its picometer boundary of the atom and its nucleus is enormous amounts of magnetism and dielectricity from the infinitely superluminal spinning nucleus of the protons and neutrons, creating charge and discharge from dielectricity and magnetism moving in equilibrium. And what happens when you make a magnet like this and you discharge capacitor banks into the magnetizer coils? It causes a disequilibrium in the magnetism and dielectricity in the interatomic, and it creates this incommensurate system of opposite moving forces, which are one and the same. You have the dielectric, which is a charging, and the ultimate resultant radiation of dielectricity, or as Faraday and Maxwell called it, the quote-unquote field of dielectricity. Okay? Dielectricity is a lost art. Now, everything you're using and running right now runs off electricity. Electricity is man-made. It is not nature's electricity. Lightning, the way what your brain operates on, what controls your body, your muscles. Lightning, nature's electricity, is not electricity, it is dielectricity. Electricity is the byproduct, and this isn't my opinion, this is cold, hard fact. Electricity, what's running your computer, your TV set, this little camera right now, is electricity. It is the byproduct of dielectricity and magnetism. Phi times psi equals Q, or electrification. This is nature's electricity. The reason this is incommensurate is because just like a gyroscope, you have 100 little gyroscopes, imagine, pointing all various directions on the floor. You spin them all up, they'll all line up. What you've done is you've spun up the inertial plane. This is an analogy, of course. Don't take it too far. You've spun up the inertial plane. This is the expanding z-axis of radiation, and this is our dielectric flywheel. Why is it in the center? As I've told you, because magnetism moves 180 degrees opposite to the dielectricity. They are 180 degrees opposite each other, and the reason they appear, but they only appear this way as 90 degrees, because here we have our polarization of magnetism, here we have our dielectricity. The only reason they appear 90 degrees opposite like this in this binding system is because they are in a binding system. That's the max throw. That is why the dielectricity is here. Dielectricity is everywhere in the magnet. Like I said, you cut it 1,000,000 times, you're going to have 1,000,000 dielectric inertial planes. It is in absolutely every atom. It is spun up like this, like trillions and trillions of little gyroscopes. Remember, don't take that analogy too far. That spin up and align themselves along lowest pressure gradients. And what you see here in the macro is in the micro at the interatomic, within trillions and trillions of atoms. That is how a magnet works. What you're seeing here is exactly what you find on the atomic scale, as the interatomic magnetodielectricity is spun up, is electrified. There is a disequilibrium between dielectricity and magnetism inside this hexagonal neodymium iron boron, but it can occur in a ferrite. So I hope you understand that, because if you don't understand this, you're not going to understand anything. The reason it's forced here is the same reason your water rises when you jump in the bathtub. It is displacement. Just like fluid mechanics, it is displacement. Binding system in the conjugate magnetodielectricity of a permanent magnet, the way it works is 180 degree oppositional movement is this hyperbola, or an inverse sphere, which is what a double hyperbola is. That is the max throw of an inverse sphere as these two forces try to pull apart from each other. That is why there is centrifugal magnetism. It returns, it reciprocates around, returns centripetally, and reintegrates. Like I said, magnetism is radiation. It is polarization. It is divergent. This is space in creation. There is no such thing as a field in space. There is only space as posterior to any and all fields. This is where Einstein screwed up. This is why Einstein was a mental midget. He actually got the idea of c squared and misunderstood it from James Clerk Maxwell as the interrelationship between dielectricity and magnetism. And he stole much of his ideas from Jean Poincaré. Our French isn't as good as it used to be.